A lot of the work that I've done in the past is on issues of trust and trustworthiness. Much of my work focuses on the relationship between citizens and governments over vast swaths of history, starting with ancient Rome and going to tomorrow, well into the future perhaps. More recently, I've been asked to do some thinking and writing about legitimacy. There is an overlap, obviously, between trust in government and the legitimacy of government. But one of the things I want to clarify as I talk is that they are not the same thing. So trust and trustworthiness really have to do with certain kinds of attributes of a government. That's the trustworthiness part. Does it meet certain standards that have to do with, are its policies meeting standards of fairness, whatever they are in a particular society and polity? Is there competence? That's an important aspect of trustworthiness. And is there a competence both in the delivery of a good or a service as well as its creation, but also competence in ensuring that there is compliance with it. Trust is really an internal belief about how we think about the other. I'm less interested in trust and trustworthiness because you're not likely to get trust unless there's some exhibition of trustworthiness, but they're not always fully correlated for reasons that will be obvious as I talk. Legitimacy is really something somewhat different because it really has to do with whether the government itself, one believes that it has been established according to processes that we think are appropriate and that there is some consensus about. And it has to do with certain kinds of values that we have that we think government should or should not meet. And again, those values are societal and consensual, though they can be conflicted. And we're in a moment, at least in the United States, of considerable conflict about what constitutes legitimacy in a government, both about processes and both about the actual values that are being met. So that's a sort of background, very academic-y background there to how I think about these problems and how I separate them. And hopefully make it a little clearer as I talk. And if I get incoherent, just raise your hands or stomp or leave the room or in some way signal me and I'll probably get back on track. But as I said, the drugs and I are battling each other right now so that I'm not in pain and so that I can be relatively coherent. Okay, so I want to start with what do we think we know about trust in government? And I'm going to show you some statistics that you've probably seen before, and then talk a little bit about why they mislead us in thinking about these issues. I hear lots of people saying trust in government has declined, look at this graph, or this is happening or that is happening. And I want to use some of these distinctions I made at the beginning to sort of clarify what we're looking at and how to think about this. And hopefully I'll be cogent enough to do that. Okay, so this is it's not easy to read, but I put a lot of this up here because it's useful to look at this. One of the longest term studies that we have in the world is the American National Election Studies, which asked a question when it began in the 1960s, 50s, late 50s, about trust in government. And the question was, how much of the time do you think you can trust the government in Washington to do what is right? Just about always, most of the time, or only some of the time? And this is the question that informs a lot of graphs that you see, not only the American ones, but also ones about Europe, about other parts of the world. These questions get used and carried over because there is this long-term thing. Now think about that question. How much of the time do you think you can trust the government in Washington to do what is right? Just about always, most of the time, or only some of the time? Now we're a democratic polity. If any of you answer all of the time, terrible answer, I would think. We should be helpful, we should be skeptical, always a little skeptical, sometimes very skeptical of what the government is doing. And what does it mean to say that the government is, do you think the government is doing what is right? Right about what? In what context? For whom? So this is a very non-contextual question, and trust and trustworthiness are very contextual concepts. The way I think about it is we're always thinking about whether we have confidence that something is trustworthy to do X in Y situation. So think about your close others. I think about my husband in this regard. When I broke my arm, I totally had confidence that he would be at my side, that he would advocate for me with the medical personnel. I did not think he would be very helpful in hanging up my clothes or helping me get dressed or getting lotions on me or the things that he just is incompetent at doing and doesn't. But that doesn't mean I don't love him. It doesn't mean I don't think he has my best interest at heart, but I don't have confidence in him to do everything, right? There are certain things I know he will do well. I know about his competencies. And other things where I know he will try to do it, but I'd really rather have my sister, right? Just to give a very, in a sense, trivial example, but to try to give you a sense that, and think about this with government. So what's happened subsequently with many of these questions is we have breakdowns in these questions. Do you trust the courts? Do you have confidence in the police? So even breaking it down a little more that way is helpful. This is such a generic question. And so people are writing these big graphs that show that public trust in government is near historic lows, and they're using that question. And first of all, I want you to note that this starts in 1960. I wonder how people thought in the 1930s. So what is the history even that we're capturing in this? So I don't doubt this, that we are at a low moment in trustworthiness in government. But I just want you to keep in mind that it's not conveying, this graph is not conveying that enough information. Do not walk away from these graphs saying we now know that government trustworthiness is at an all-time low. All-time low relative to what? To the heyday after the World War II when there was incredible economic growth, when it was the real intensity of the civil rights movements and all the other movements that happened. So it's a very problematic set of figures. Hopefully I've gotten that point across now. Okay, the same thing goes for a lot of these other questions that we see. This is trust in government by party, and this is hardly surprising that when the Republicans are in power, there's higher trust in government by Republicans. When the Democrats in power, it flips. The Democrats who have less trust in government when Republicans are in power have more trust. And that has to do with questions about competence and about, yes, of course, that's true. That is hardly a surprise. We see that there has been, and I think there's some, again, there's some truth in this, but we also have to take these figures with a bit of a grain of salt. That if we look at 4 critical institutions in the post-2016 election period, we see that there has been a decline in trust by these kinds of surveys in both media and in government. And again, no surprises there, but we have to understand that this isn't telling us that we have total distrust in government. Many of us, sorry, I went the wrong direction. Many of us still have confidence in government that certain things will happen. So decline in one dimension doesn't mean that we have total decline in another dimension, right? This is just fun. I don't totally believe this graph, but it's sort of fun. People like to see where the US stands relative to other countries. The people trust their government the most in India and in Canada. And in Turkey. Okay, now that's interesting, right? That should make you wonder about this graph. The United States, is it even, yeah, it's way down there, 30%. But it is above Greece and South Korea. Grain of salt, please. This is the percent of trust in government and change from 2016 to 2017, which, as we know, is an historical blip. I mean, I don't know what to do with a graph that is covering this short a period of time. But again, we can see that the US is not exactly a high trust government by these kinds of measures. And just another one of those kinds of graphs. The trust in media plunges to an all-time low. I'm looking for a clock so I don't go over too much. Do I?
I'll let you know.
Oh, okay. So I want to give time for questions, so be sure to stop me or give me a heads up a little bit ahead of time. Okay. Sorry, that's not, I should have double checked this. I hope you can read that. I meant to make it white on blue, not black on blue, but that's how I'm sort of feeling, black and blue. Okay, so there are a couple of key points that I want to make here. To think about trust in government or any institutions, it is not a static relationship. It's a dynamic set of interactions. It's a result of an interaction between citizens and whatever institution, whether government, medical care, whatever it is, education that we're talking about. And it's about something particular, not generic or innate. So we don't have confidence that government, even those of us who believe that government is continuing to do many of the things that it needs to do, like provide basic security, basic welfare and social insurance and a few other things, even if we argue with the content of that, we still think there are lots of things in which it's not doing its job at all. So people will argue about whether they have confidence in government, the institutions, the arrangements, the bureaucracy, to actually do certain kinds of tasks before it, whether they be war tasks or control, trying to provide information about the media, whatever. But there'll be lots of variation in that. The one other thing I wanted to tell you about those questions that this reminds me about is often when you're asked the question on that ANES survey or in the, one of the other various surveys that are out there, the Eurobarometer or any of the others, when you're asked if you trust government, a lot of people don't think about government. They think about who is the chief governor, who's the president, who's the prime minister. And the question is often answered as a popularity question rather than do you have confidence in the institutions? And that's part of why I like breaking this question down. So if we're really thinking about the institutions and not who's running the institutions, and that is a critical question right now. So the critical question in the United States, in Britain, in France, throughout the world, in North Korea, is whatever you think of the person who's in charge, what do you think of the institutions and the arrangements? Do we think that democracy is working? Do we think the bureaucracy is working? Do we think that when the IRS collects our taxes, as it recently did, that they're actually going to more or less where they're supposed to go? We actually, as a country, have very high confidence in our institutions, such as the IRS. We may hate it. We may feel like some of the rules are inappropriate. We may feel that at times it's intrusive. But we don't hear lots of complaints these days about a lot of corruption. It's not like the tax collectors are pocketing the money. We have some confidence that the money is going where it is supposed to. So these interactions are a crucial part of the story. That also leads to my second point. Institutional trustworthiness is often multidimensional, can be trustworthy in some regards and not in others. And I want to argue that citizen perceptions are affected by other things than reality. Again, not a hard question in a conference and a set of conversations about what's happened with social media and with news. And I'm going to give you an example of that in a minute. Actually, let me go forward to that and then. Okay, so here's a case where we hear lots of expression of the inadequacy of the police and of our justice system, and a lot of very fair criticisms coming from groups of people who are, in fact, badly served, like those who are expressing their voices through Black Lives Matter. And we as a country have, in some of these surveys, our populations have said that they have lost confidence in the police and in our security, our personal security. But in fact, crime rates have fallen significantly since the early 1960s. So here is an example of a case where our reality and how we think about trust are not always together. public perceptions of crime rates are at odds with reality, just to give a concrete example of what I'm trying to say here. So that part of the issue is to think about what is it that affects citizens' perceptions of reality and how to realign their perceptions with what is actually the case, right? And that's a very complex question that has to do with how our social media and news operates, but also a much deeper question, which this is where the academics really have to come up and play their role, about how people form and sustain the beliefs that they have. What kinds of cues they take as signaling that this is credible information. Who do they look for that information? And how do they deeply internalize and sustain those beliefs? The final point I want to make in this sort of basic summary is I have always argued, and part of my work has been based on the fact that behavioral measures are better than surveys. So I've looked a lot at compliance with military service, both volunteering and actual compliance with the draft over history in multiple countries, thinking about compliance and non-compliance in a variety of societal ways, with taxes, thinking about compliance and non-compliance with laws, police, et cetera. Those are behavioral measures of when people actually have confidence in government or not. Okay, so trust of institutions really depends on institutional behavior and evidence of their trustworthiness, the attributes that I laid out. And it depends also on the citizen. This is about an interaction, right? So it depends on the citizen-consumer perception. Are institutions actually delivering what they promise? And again, we have to delve deep here because sometimes they are and people don't understand that they are. So how do we transform that understanding? Are institutions inhibiting free riding, or are they treating folks differently? And what I mean by that is that when you think about compliance behavior, one of the crucial ways in which compliance is achieved, there are multiple sources. I'm going to emphasize two. One is what I call voluntary or quasi-voluntary compliance. A rule is in place, but we obey the law or obey the rule because we really think it is the right thing to do. We understand that this is to make a government work or to make that process work. It's important for us to comply. But we will only do so if we believe that others are also complying, or enough others are also complying. You don't want to volunteer for the military and be the only soldier, right? You don't want to be one of a very few paying taxes. So this is the free riding problem. So a variety of things can change that, but the most important, other than looking around and seeing what people are doing, is having confidence that government has the capacity, and this is a competence issue that affects its trustworthiness, that government actually has the capacity to identify the free riders or the non-compliant and to punish them. So I want to believe that my government, what it means for me to think government is trustworthy is in part, I believe that it will, if I comply, it will ensure that others also comply, that it has the capacity, and that it's not playing favorites. So if we look over history, we see all kinds of, even into the current era, we see certain groups or individuals given differential treatment that we think is deeply unfair and that undermines our own compliance. I could give you concrete examples, but I don't have time. I can elaborate in questions if we need to. So what changes citizens' perceptions? This is really, in many ways, the very key issue. We start with beliefs about how the world works, and sometimes our beliefs are consistent with reality, and sometimes they're not. Education, information, news, all of that affects those beliefs. I'm a believer that in order to affect those beliefs, we really have to think about the processes by which people get information and can challenge the information that they get and learn from that process how to engage in the right kind of critical thinking and assessment, can identify who is expert and who is not. These are not simple questions, but this is just to give you an idea of how to think about it. And I have ideas about that I've played with in a variety of contexts. Beliefs about what institutions should do actually do shift over time. Right now, one of the things we're doing at CASBIS, at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences, is to think about how to restructure the political economy and reframe it so that it makes its values explicit, so that we're creating a moral economy. And that shift has happened in the lifetime of most of us. I'm not seeing a lot of very young people here. I'm almost there. When we think about the shift in the framework that dominated thinking that came in with Thatcher and Reagan. So we moved from a Keynesian perspective on the world to a neoliberal perspective on the world. Ideology, values, our beliefs about how the world works are mutable, and we have a responsibility to help affect that. I've already talked about how it's often disconnected. Let me finish here with a graph that I did, a diagram I did with Audrey Sachs, who works with the World Bank, who's a former student of mine, about how you create a virtual circle of governance. And we use the word governance here because it should apply not just to government, but to a whole variety of settings. And it has to do with those attributes I talked about, which makes a government or an institution trustworthy. It has to do with procedural justice or fairness according to the norms of the current day and place. And that will create what we call value-based legitimacy. Tom Tyler at the Yale Law School was also involved in helping to develop this. Or legitimating beliefs, which then should lead to behavioral-based legitimacy or compliance, which then loops back to improve the capacity of government. So how you intervene at these different stages is a crucial part of the story. I had all kinds of pictures to show you that have to do with social movements and ways in which they're expressing new kinds of values, concerns about legitimacy, but you've seen the pictures before, so I won't end here.